Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. My name is Sean Duffy. I'm your host. I have a couple of announcements before we introduce our guest for today. This Thursday, our People's University live stream continues. The series is Physical Science. Dr. Stacy Kafalos Vargas from VMI will be back. This will be the finale of the series. 6:30 p.m. Thursday. She'll be telling us about what she does primarily, her primary research interest, light, lasers, and free space optics. So that'll be Thursday. And then next Tuesday, we will have the second Ann Thomas Memorial Lecture on February 23rd at noon, Lunch with Books live stream right here on this channel. Our guest will be Crystal Wilkinson, who is an excellent African-American writer, poet from Kentucky, teaches creative writing at the University of Kentucky, and she's just an amazing author. So that'll be next week at noon. It is Black History Month, and you can learn about a Wheeling man named Henry B. Clemens, who was a slave, who rose from slavery to become a community leader and everyone's favorite barber. That is on archivingwheeling.org currently. Our guest today is Barbara Ellen Smith. She is the author or editor of 4 books and numerous articles about labor, economic justice, women, social movements in Appalachia and the South, including the book she'll be telling you about today, Digging Our Own Graves, Coal Miners and the Struggle Over Black Lung Disease. This is an updated version from Haymarket Books. You can get the book at haymarket.org, or haymarketbooks.org. She'll tell you more about that. She is from Charleston and is professor emerita at Virginia Tech. And if you do buy a book, she'll tell you about that too. The royalties will go to the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. Here is Barbara Ellen Smith.
Thanks so much, Sean, and thanks to all of you who support this great program at the Ohio County Public Library. I really appreciate it. And a special thanks, of course, to everyone who's joining us today watching this program. As Sean mentioned, I came out with Digging Our Own Graves first in 1987, actually, and for decades afterwards didn't even consider the possibility of revising or updating the book. Writing a book is a little bit like having a baby. You don't want to do it again too soon. So I was not thinking about this at all until about 5 years ago, when it became clear that we were seeing a resurgence of Black lung in central Appalachia specifically, that is to say southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southwest Virginia. And it wasn't just a resurgence of disease, but in some ways it's actually been an intensification of disease, in the sense that the most advanced and lethal form of Black lung is now at the highest rate that has ever been recorded in the scientific literature. So this is a disease that was supposedly destined for elimination in 1969, the passage of the U.S. Coal Mine Health and Safety Act. But today we are seeing, as I said, rates that exceed anything recorded in the scientific literature. So what on earth is going on? Part of my motivation for revisiting the book was not only this kind of resurgence and intensification, but also the fact that the explanations on offer did not really grapple with what I felt were some of the most important reasons why we're seeing this escalation of the problem of Black lung. Most explanations involve more scientific and technical factors like the composition of mine dust. There's increasing silica in a lot of coal mine dust, again, particularly in central Appalachia. Other explanations featured the Mine Safety and Health Administration and its failure to adopt the silica standards in the coal industry, which is certainly egregious. But I would argue that those explanations don't really address the kind of social and economic context that is also fundamental to the production of disease. And particularly that context involves not only the declining fortunes of the coal industry, but the quite intentional effort by coal operators, that is, owners, managers, to destroy the United Mine Workers during the 1980s. particularly during the 1980s, but extending into the 1990s as well, which has left coal miners without a collective source of countervailing power in the workplace. And this is really fundamental, I would argue, to the production of disease. Let me, because this is such a strong theme in the book, I want to read just a quick passage that expresses this idea that we really need to think of occupational disease, particularly in the coal industry, but actually elsewhere, as socially produced, not just the function of some inert material. So in the coal camps of southern West Virginia, the black dust of the mines is everywhere. It collects at the sides of the narrow two-lane roads, coats the green grass of lawns, and settles on children's toys left in yards. When coal is cut from the seam, where it is laid for eons, dust boils up like a thick soup and overflows onto every nearby surface. From the perspective of science and engineering, this dust is the cause of occupational respiratory disease. Human interaction in the mines where dust is produced is of little relevance. The isolated physical object dust and the isolated biological object, the respiratory system, are the primary focus. Yet within a deeper meaning of causation, this scientific perspective appears ideological, even kind of magical, because it robs human beings of their powers of action and causation and invests these powers in inanimate objects. Dust does not arise like a ghost in the night from the underground graves of the mine. Dust and disease are produced no less than coal itself by the actions and decisions of human beings in the workplaces of the coal industry. So I would argue that that kind of perspective regarding the social and economic relations that condition the production of disease is really important, not only in understanding the resurgence of black lung and the intensification of black lung, but also is at stake in many other diseases, certainly in occupational diseases. So I want to talk more about the recent developments that I think are important to look at if we're really going to understand why black lung has seen such a resurgence. But let me start with a little bit of historical background. Despite what seems to be, I think for most of us, a pretty obvious relationship between working in a coal mine, a dusty environment, underground, the surface miners can also get black lung, and inhaling dust every day in your workplace and finally contracting a lung disease that is ultimately disabling. It seems like a pretty obvious relationship, and yet the medical profession throughout much of the late 19th and into the 20th century in the United States did not recognize black lung as a legitimate occupationally related lung disease of coal miners. Coal miners and their families recognized it. They tended to call it miners' asthma. But the medical profession as a whole trivialized the existence of any disease that was related to their work and disabled their respiratory system. So miners were told that, they were malingering, they were seeking to evade work or gain compensation in an unethical manner, or that they had an irrational fear of the mine. So even after Great Britain recognized black lung and extended compensation to those who were afflicted with it, which occurred in the 1940s, still in most states of the United States, coal miners were denied any compensation for an occupationally related lung disease. That was certainly true in West Virginia, which was the largest coal-producing state in the country. So this all finally changed in the late 1960s, but it was not because of a change of heart on the part of the medical profession, at least initially. It was because coal miners themselves forcefully intervened to insist on the legitimacy of their own disease experience. This occurred with the help of three sympathetic physicians, Dr. Donald Rasmussen, very famously, who also continued to work in a pulmonary lab in Beckley until his case of death, serving coal miner patients, and 2 other positions, as well as young organizers who came out of the War on Poverty programs, joined with miners and organized. They picketed, they marched, and they ultimately went on strike to force the West Virginia legislature to recognize black lung as a compensable disease under the workers' compensation statutes of West Virginia. They were successful in doing that, although there were many restrictions on the way the disease was defined, and that's a theme that I'll pick up again in a minute. But finally, black lung was at least recognized to a limited extent in the state of West Virginia under its own compensation statute. This period of the late 60s, of course, was a time of massive upheaval, not only in West Virginia, but all over the United States and indeed the world. And black lung was certainly not the only issue that people in West Virginia were taking up. In the coalfields, this was also the period of time when Jack Yablonsky ran a reform campaign for president of the United Mine Workers. Yablonsky, along with his wife and daughter, was assassinated by the president of the Union, Tony Boyle, not directly, but by his henchmen. But at Yablonsky's funeral, miners organized to found what they called the Miners for Democracy, a movement to reform the United Mine Workers. And so you got this convergence of organizing, not only around black lung, but also around union reform in the early 1970s. And this really contributed to an emphasis on occupational health and safety, which was certainly one of the complaints and focuses of activism by coal miners and their families at this time. 1969 also saw passage of the U.S. Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, and this was extremely important for the continuation of black lung activism, as well as for the hope of the elimination of black lung. The act set a respirable dust standard, a very strict one for underground coal mines, and it also offered an unprecedented federal compensation program for miners and widows of miners who were afflicted with black lung and disabled from it. So this compensation program actually became the focus of subsequent activism, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to really emphasize the incredible sense of rank and file power that miners felt during this period. And there's a photo from the book that if Sean would pull up, I think it helps to illustrate. You can see, better than words can convey the kind of sense of bravado. Steve Shapiro is the guy on the left. He's the head of the safety committee at a mine in southern West Virginia. The guy next to him is also on the safety committee, and the photo also illustrates the kind of interracialism that has been a hallmark of UMW organizing since its founding in 1890. This is also a period of time when, because of the mechanization and unemployment that followed World War II, when you had a limited number of decreasing number of miners able to keep their jobs during the 40s and 50s, early 60s, you had massive out-migration. By the late 60s and early 70s, there's actually a labor shortage in the Appalachian coal industry. And so this is enhancing rank and file power and sense of leverage. It's at this moment in time that you also see women going into the mines. And Earl Dotter has a great photo of 4 women miners that, Sean, if you could pull that up, that would be great. It really, finally, women who had demanded access to jobs in the mines begin to get them in the 1970s. That, of course, also means that they're subject to some of the occupational hazards, including black lung. But the 1970s also see, those of you who are old enough to remember the Arab oil embargo and those gas line, long lines at gas stations and so on. This makes coal the energy of choice in the United States for at least a brief period of time, and further enhances miners' economic leverage and bargaining power. So the 70s is really kind of a heyday of possibility. But at the same time, there are economic developments going on in the coal industry that are starting to undermine this rank and file strength. And that includes the development of massive strip mines out west. These really begin to accelerate during the 1970s. They're highly productive. The seams of coal are very thick. The coal itself is not of great quality, but nonetheless, it's low sulfur and it's very useful for electric utilities that are trying to meet the low sulfur requirements of the Clean Air Act. And so you see a shift in coal production in the United States toward the West, and companies that are left with their holdings in the East are selling some of them off. They are, in some cases, actually moving entirely out west to that coal field. Others are moving towards subcontracting, where smaller operators are working with more marginal operations and still trying to make ends meet. And there is tremendous pressure to cut costs, especially, of course, labor costs, which is a significant portion of the cost of production. So this hit central Appalachia, again, southern West Virginia, not northern, southern West Virginia, East Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, especially hard because the mines here tend to be of thinner seams, and you see an increase during the 1980s, becomes really evident in the early 1980s and continuing into the 90s, an increase in small mines in central Appalachia. These are mines where fewer than 50 people work. So they tend to be mechanized to some extent with continuous miners, but they are often referred to as dog hole mines because their working conditions tend to be really bad. There's a historical photo that is part of the gallery that Earl Dotter put together for the book. And Sean, if you could pull that up, it illustrates why these mines are called dog holes. This is a photo probably from the late 19th century, but in really small operations, miners used to, at one time, literally use dogs as haulage animals to just pull coal out of a drift mine that would go into the side of a mountain. And so the conditions, as you can imagine, in these smaller mines where there's very little capital to invest tend to be really poor, and miners tend to use that term to refer to smaller mines where the working conditions tend to be especially grueling. As it turns out, there is also a relationship between small mines and the incidence of black lung, a strong relationship actually. Miners who work in small mines for a long period of time tend to have a much higher incidence of the disease. So let me also offer you a more recent photo also of a so-called dog hole mine. Again, very thin seam. This is actually taken in Logan County by Earl Dotter, I think 1976. So this is not ancient history. This isn't the late 19th century, but this is a guy hauling explosives to the face in order to set a charge and blast the coal loose. So let me actually read a description by a coal miner in southern West Virginia of what it's like to work in his experience in a small mine. This is Danny Quick. He's from Mingo County. He's retired now. But he said, I worked at one small, it was a non-union mine. They told me when they hired me, when you come to work here, we don't pack a lunch bucket. We don't have time. If we break down, we either want you shoveling coal on the belt or hanging curtains or hanging cable or something. They have really, really bad equipment, old equipment, trying to get by cheap as they can, mine coal and make money. Their primary objective was to get that coal out. They'd get you inside. It was about 5 miles. And the ride they'd take you in on would have to sit out there and charge for 8 to 10 hours before they could come back in to get you. That's how bad the batteries were. So the point is that obviously working in smaller mines tends to be particularly hazardous for miners' health as well as their safety, actually. And for those of you who may be in northern West Virginia and familiar with the coal industry there, I want to emphasize that the mines that I'm talking about are particularly from southern West Virginia. Northern West Virginia is considered for the purposes of sort of mining classifications, part of northern Appalachia, western Pennsylvania, southeast Ohio, northern West Virginia are all considered part of that sort of coal producing area where the seams tend to be much thicker, the mines are much more heavily mechanized, they tend to be much larger on average, and they also tend to be long wall operations, which are highly productive. So there's an important distinction between the mines in the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. And indeed, during this period that I'm talking about, the 80s, the 90s, when miners in southern West Virginia, over half are working in small mines in most years. In the northern part of the state, at most 20%, and in many years, 10% or so of miners who work underground are working in smaller mines. So there's quite a contrast. So as part of this trend towards cost cutting, really hammering on labor costs and trying to increase productivity as part of this sort of competitive environment, coal operators and A.T. Massey in particular began to move against the unions. In 1981, Massey opened a non-union operation in Boone County, and despite the United Mine Workers' efforts to prevent scab workers from crossing picket lines, Massey is able to maintain that mine and continue to operate it. In '84, Massey moves again against the union with the expiration of the contract, and this time the struggle is further south. It's in Mingo County, the epicenter of it anyway. It's actually through many counties in southern West Virginia, but Mingo County is kind of an epicenter of it, partly because there's a big preparation plant there where a lot of Massey coal is funneled to be processed. It also extends into eastern Kentucky into Pike County, where there are also a number of Massey operations. And the head of Massey at this time is somebody whose name is pretty familiar, perhaps infamous in West Virginia, Don Blankenship. He is sort of orchestrating this move against the union, and he's doing so in southern West Virginia in an area that has been known for fierce struggles over unionism going back to the 1910s and 20s, the famous Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, Battle of Matewan in 1920, and so on. So this is an area with a very strong union tradition, but it is also an area where Don Blankenship very shrewdly figures out how to not only come up with reportedly $200,000 a month to pay for extensive security operations, surveillance footage, big cyclone fences, helicopters to bring in food and workers, an armored personnel carrier on standby in case there's a need for evacuation and so on. But he is also breaking up the dense networks of kinship and union loyalty and community ties that are part of the social web of this area. Let me read a quote from an interview. This is with Hawkeye Dixon, a leader in Local 1440 in Mingo County, southern West Virginia. He says, there were two things you didn't do. You didn't blaspheme against the Holy Ghost, and you didn't cross the picket line. You brought shame on your whole family when you done that. It was the worst two things you could do. Now, Don Blankenship, he's shrewd. He's no dummy. He's extremely shrewd. Seems to me like he made it a point to find somebody in every family that he could get to cross the picket line. He split families, and there's hard feelings to this day. I had a cousin that went to scabbing. He's passed away. Loved him to death, but I never felt the same about him. The family didn't. And even the kids today have to live with what he'd done to the rest of the family. It's just not acceptable. You don't go across the picket line that your brother is on, that your sister's husband is on. You just don't do that. You just don't do that. But in the context of Blankenship's strategic maneuvering, that did happen, of course, and the results were extremely divisive. They were also successful to the extent that the unionization rates of coal miners in central Appalachia are now about 7%, which is an enormous decline from what they once were, especially in southern West Virginia, virtually 100%. Let me ask you, Sean, to pull up another photo. This is one of a more mechanized mine. I meant to show it when I was talking about mines in northern West Virginia. This is actually also by Earl Dotter, of course, and again, part of the photo gallery of his work that's in the book. This is a mine, Rushton mine in western Pennsylvania, but it shows you can perhaps see on the bottom, you see miners going in into the mine, and on the top, there's a big conveyor belt that's bringing coal out of the mine. And so you just see the kind of infrastructure there that is quite a contrast to the photo that we were looking at earlier of a guy on his knees in a very thin, small mine. By far the most famous strike of this period was the Pittston strike in Southwest Virginia. This took place in 1989, and Earl Dotter was there and took a number of, I think, terrific photos of what occurred during Pittston. There's another one that, Sean, if you could pull up the next photo. This is Cecil Roberts, who is the current president of the United Mine Workers, speaking to the throngs of folks who came to Camp Solidarity on the banks of the Clinch River in Southwest Virginia. Pittston was really, it became kind of a people's movement. Not Cecil, but Rich Trumka, who was the president of the union during the Pittston strike, was famous for saying that, when we play by their rules, meaning, the rules of labor laws and the injunctions that the unions had gotten, when we play by their rules, we lose. They had learned that in the Massey strikes, that when they limited the size of their picket lines, that they were required to do so by various injunctions, they suffered fines and so on. They lost. But at Pittston, the union really tried to mobilize people from all over the place. Ultimately, 40,000 people at least had come to Southwest Virginia to Camp Solidarity to support this strike. And it won, sort of, but we're still unable to really halt the anti-union offensive. So even though Pittston won with a victory, and indeed Trumka declared a victory for the entire labor movement because this was such a period of offensive against labor all over the United States, indeed the world, they, as I say, were not able to really stem the tide of anti-unionism in the coal industry. So what does all this have to do with black lung? Well, let's get back to that. You talk to union miners today, and you hear story after story after story of the conditions in non-union mines, which many were forced to work in toward the end of their careers. They talk about no water sprays on equipment, poor ventilation, you don't hang curtain, you don't move curtain, which is used to control the ventilation system. You don't worry about a dust sampling. You just put the dust sampler in your lunchbox, you hang it in the intake where the air comes into the mine, put it anywhere but on yourself where it's supposed to be to measure dust levels. It's a real disregard for the practices that had been put in place, at least on the law books and the regulations, to limit black lung disease and indeed eliminate it. So let me read again a quote. This is from miners talking about how they don't even know how long the workday is going to be. I have talked to miners who just one after another spoke about how, you didn't work just one shift, you worked a shift and a half, you worked two shifts. One guy worked in the mines 4 days. He slept overnight in the mines. This is Larry Ramsey. You never know when quitting time was. You started to work. You might work your shift, the next shift, but until the next man comes in, you don't leave. If a miner operator, meaning the person who operates the continuous mining machine, miner operator didn't show up, bosses didn't ask you, do you want to stay over? They asked you, what do you want to eat? So the statistics actually bear this out. The Mine Safety and Health Administration statistics on the number of hours worked have risen by about a third since the 1980s. And, but they don't really show the kind of economic coercion that is behind these conditions. So this is the kind of social economic context in which black lung begins to be produced, because of course it takes several years for lung disease to show up. I think, today we are seeing the consequences of these kinds of practices. So, and this is also the context in which it becomes clear that the content of mine dust, at least in some locations, and again, particularly in central Appalachia, is changing such that there is increased silica in the dust, and silica acts like ground glass in the lungs. It's extremely harmful, and so lung disease is developing more quickly in younger miners, and thus we see not only a resurgence, but as I was saying at the outset, a kind of intensification of the disease. So, despite all of this, and indeed in part because of this, we see a continuing activism around black lung to this day. There are 7 county-level Black Lung Association chapters in West Virginia. There are chapters in Eastern Kentucky. There are chapters in Southwest Virginia, Ohio, and elsewhere. And these folks are continuing to assist miners and widows with compensation claims, but they are also lobbying to ensure adequate financing for the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund, which pays the cost of compensation to miners when the responsible operator cannot be found. The fund is financed through an excise tax on coal. They're also organizing to get MSHA, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, to issue a separate standard for silica in the coal industry. And they're also trying to save the pensions of miners who have retired in a context where coal industry bankruptcies are widespread, and the industry is, as we all know, collapsing. I would note, however, even as we see coal mines shutting every day in states like West Virginia, there is talk that should the infrastructure bill pass Congress, that will potentially shore up the domestic steel industry and thereby also the demand for metallurgical coal, which is found particularly in Southwest Virginia and Southern West Virginia, as well as Alabama and a few other places. So that could revive portions of the coal industry at least. So the story continues and the struggle goes on. Let me note, as Sean said at the outset, that all the royalties from the sale of this book go to support the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, which is located in Matewan in Southern West Virginia. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you. Let me stop there and invite your questions, comments, thoughts.
Hi, Barbara. Breaking in here. I haven't seen any questions yet, although there are a lot of nice comments. So if anyone does have a question, please type it in the comments field on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you happen to be watching, and we'll be able to see it here. The number of, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I do have something that, when I get rolling talking about this, I often forget about some of the things I want to mention. And so I could say something about a little bit more about the medical politics of black lung. I didn't want to get into this. It's very complicated and convoluted. But one of the things that led to kind of a resurgence of black lung organizing in 1970, after passage of the Coal Mine Health and Safety Act and after the development of this federal compensation program, was the fact that coal miners who, were so breathless that they could hardly walk up their driveway to their mailbox, or, get from their bedroom to the kitchen, were denied compensation. And what was happening was that the Social Security Administration, which administered the program at that time, had adopted an extremely restrictive definition of black lung. And I want to make a point here because there's often an equation made, particularly by journalists, between black lung and coal workers' pneumoconiosis. So you'll often see, sort of black lung is like the lay term, but the real scientific term is like coal workers' pneumoconiosis. That's actually not quite accurate. Coal workers' pneumoconiosis is, by definition, an occupationally related disease that coal miners contract in the workplace. However, coal miners can contract other diseases in their lungs in the workplace, such as emphysema, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. These diseases are not exclusively occupationally related, but they can definitely be caused by, associated with dust inhalation underground, or for that matter on the surface in very dusty environments. And so part of the controversy over black lung has been the fact that the more conservative wing of the medical establishment has consistently argued for limiting black lung solely to coal workers' pneumoconiosis and only compensating you if you have X-ray evidence of that disease, and particularly in its most advanced form. So part of the ongoing controversy of the black lung movement has been this struggle really over the definition of disease with physicians, with agency administrators, and with lawyers, coal company lawyers, who, of course, for their own interests, seek to narrow the definition of disease to a very limited scope.
Yeah. We do have a question. I'll put it up on the screen.
Yeah, actually, not only oil and gas workers, I think, workers in many workplaces suffer from occupation-related diseases that are not recognized as work-related in many cases, and thus are not compensable. Oil and gas workers, definitely. Working in the oil industry and the gas industry, there's various cancers and other problems that can arise from work. The problem like that of black lung is that it can be very difficult to prove on an individual level that the disease you have was contracted because of your work. If you get bladder cancer, that can be related to exposure to certain chemicals in the workplace, but you can also be exposed to other things that will cause it outside of the workplace. And so part of the struggle that so many workers, as well as environmentalists, have found is, demonstrating conclusively with scientifically proven evidence that, that contaminated water supply or that particular chemical, or whatever it is that you were exposed to, either in your community or your workplace, is the direct cause of what you are suffering from. It's very difficult to do that on an individual case-by-case basis. And that's why you have in the Black Lung Compensation Program actually a very complicated architecture of laws and presumptions that something is work-related. in this case, black lung, because it's very difficult to prove. So yes, absolutely, I would say that oil and gas workers face similar difficulties in terms of occupational exposures, diseases, and also proving that they should be compensable.
Yeah. We have another question about silica and the problems that arise from it versus in the past. She wanted you to talk more about that.
Okay. So silica is really an important example, I think, for various reasons, because for a long time, one of the reasons why coal miners were, or the medical profession was denying the idea that black lung even existed, was because their standard for respiratory harm was silica. Silica was recognized as extremely toxic to the lungs when you inhale silica dust. And actually here in West Virginia, the Hawks Nest disaster with the drilling of the water tunnel near Gauley Bridge in the Hawks Nest Mountains, when Union Carbide was trying to create a water tunnel, when hundreds, if not thousands, of workers died from basically silicosis poisoning as they were drilling through almost pure silica rock. Was part of the recognition of silica as such a terrible agent of disease. Workers in the anthracite industry and to some extent in western Pennsylvania, but mainly in the eastern Pennsylvania coalfields, which are the only area where anthracite coal is found in this country, were sometimes diagnosed as having what was called anthracosilicosis because the coal that they were mining was of really very little of it mined now, but was of such a hard quality. I don't know if it actually contained silica to a disproportionate degree, but in any case, their X-rays did reveal patterns that looked sort of like silicosis, and so there was a tendency to acknowledge that, well, maybe if you're exposed to silica in the course of mining, then you can get silicosis, but there's not a separate disease associated with just plain old coal dust inhalation, absent the presence of silica. So silica has been part of a complicated mix of the medical politics of this disease for a long time, but it's quite clear that in recent years, as miners are working in these thinner and thinner seams, they're trying to access seams, they're drilling through rock, the continuous miner, the drum on it exceeds the width of the seam in some cases, and so you're just in routine mining, you're drilling into rock, and silica exposure has really increased.
Here's another question.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I guess everybody can see the question. The idea that a single payer system is perhaps one of the conclusions of the arguments that I'm making. And yes, it is. And to add to that or bolster that is the fact that part of the reason for coal operators to oppose black lung claims, and I haven't really gone into the details of the process, but basically now that the coal industry, as opposed to the taxpayers who were putting the bill for black lung compensation in the earlier years, we're actually doing so now too. But anyway, coal operators are supposed to be paying it, which also entitles them to contest every black lung claim made against them. But part of their incentive is not only the cost of the compensation benefits, but also the fact that they are required to cover the medical expenses. And when you start talking about the medical expenses of someone with severe respiratory disability, including things like lung transplants, we are talking enormous dollars here. And it's partly because of that the industry, many operators anyway, will oppose any black lung claim made against them. So yes, I think single payer. I also think, though, it's an argument that we are seeing the rationale for with COVID, for a far more robust public health infrastructure and far more attention to things like the occupational sources of disease.
Okay. Here's another healthcare related question.
So this is a question about compensation in a context where bankruptcy is taking place. This is a big issue these days because, as you might suspect, many coal companies have declared bankruptcy. However, there is also an argument that some lawyers have been making in a very interesting article that I think was in the Stanford Law Review regarding the ways that coal companies are using the bankruptcy process to shed obligations to pay into the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund or to pay Black Lung benefits and, for that matter, to pay costs of reclamation and cleanup post-mining. So, in other words, what some companies are doing is spinning off smaller subsidiaries that are designed to fail and loading onto them all of their obligations, environmentally related as well as occupational health related. So in that context, though, to answer your question, when an operator goes bankrupt, refuses to pay, can't be found, whatever, the cost of compensation is paid by the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund, which is financed through an excise tax on the sale of coal. However, it does not include, it's only on domestic coal sales. Of course, coal sales are tanking right now, and so the trust fund is grossly undernourished. It's actually never been able to pay the full cost of compensation since its inception. So it is in debt to the U.S. Treasury, which keeps bailing it out. That's why I mentioned earlier that taxpayers are actually funding much of the cost of Black Lung compensation. But so, yes, the compensation is financed, but it is financed through a different mechanism, not the individual companies often.
Well, perhaps a question to end on. You mentioned Massey and how he encouraged family members to cross picket lines. And of course, starting with Reagan, the continuous sort of war on unions. And that number you mentioned of union miners now is just shocking to me.
Yeah.
Such a low number. How do we come back from that? Is it even possible?
Well, I think it's going to be really hard in the coal industry, given how, how production is collapsing, basically, and, workers' bargaining leverage is so minimal in a context where, we have widespread unemployment already in places like southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. However, there are many proposals put forward by people in the labor movement for ways that unions could, the capacity to organize could be made a lot easier. I mean, ever since the Reagan years that you referenced, Sean, folks may know, we've seen just a tidal wave of court decisions and rulings by the National Labor Relations Board and so on against unions that have made it more and more difficult to organize. Right to work laws, of course, are an impediment. Even in West Virginia, incredibly enough, we have a right to work law, which prohibits unions from just collecting dues based on, if you've unionized a place, you get a so-called closed shop and you just deduct union dues from workers' pay, but that's rendered illegal. So there are a number of things that can be done in terms of changing the legal environment for organizing that, perhaps with this new administration we'll see. I think it's also heartening that we're seeing the community-based labor organizing and have seen that for a very long time with things like the Fight for 15. And hopefully our senator in West Virginia will have a change of heart and decide to support that.
Yeah, there is hope. And the teachers gave us hope. Thank you, Barbara. Very sad, but excellent presentation and a necessary discussion. thank you for sharing that information with us.
Thank you very much.
Just a reminder, this Thursday, our People's University science concludes with Dr. Vargas, and she'll tell us about lights and lasers. And next Tuesday, the Ann Thomas Memorial Lecture series continues with Crystal Wilkinson. Ann's son, Scott Thomas, will be with us to do an introduction. And so that's next week on the 23rd. Again, if you buy this book at haymarketbooks.org, the royalties will go to support the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. And we thank Barbara again for a great presentation, and thank all of you for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye now.